we are now coming to the actual high point of our extraordinary meeting. I would like to welcome Nigel Farage from the United Kingdom. Mr. Farage is the leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party as well as a member of the European Parliament. Together with other EU-critical parties, the UKIP forms the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy group in the Parliament. Mr. Farage's speech is titled "Euro Doomed to Die." We are very much looking forward to hearing you, Mr. Farage, to see the situation in your country, the situation in Europe, and of course, the situation in the EU-free Switzerland. Good luck.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
It's quite something for me because normally when I leave my island and visit the continent of Europe, I'm visiting Strasbourg. How about that? We have liftoff. Well, I have to say this is not the first time on leaving my island that I've had difficulty with the microphones in Europe. Because in the European Parliament, President Schulz can't wait to turn my microphone off. So I'm fairly used to this sort of thing. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me here today. And there was a famous British comedian years ago, and his sign-off line used to be, "You lucky people." And when I come to Switzerland, and I get off the aeroplane, and I realise that I've just left the European Union, I have to say to you, you lucky people. Well done, Switzerland. And I say that as somebody that comes from the country that I think can lay claim to having developed the concept of parliamentary democracy. You know, there are some on the Isle of Man and in Iceland who'll say they've been doing it for longer, but actually it really was during the 13th century and from Magna Carta and onwards that we were a country that developed the idea of parliamentary democracy and indeed sold that concept to much of the rest of the world. And of course, the reason that parliamentary democracy works is because however unhappy you are with the government of the day, however bad you think their policies are, you get the opportunity once every 4 or 5 years to say you're a rotten lot of so-and-sos. We're going to get rid of you and replace you with somebody else. And the reason that works is because people don't turn to violence. People accept they've got a rotten government, but urge themselves and their friends to change it next time round. It is a system of freedom, it is a system of self-determination, it is a system of liberty. It is one that previous generations in my country thought was so important, not just for us, but for Belgium, for Poland, and for other countries, that twice in the 20th century, at massive sacrifice, we fought world wars to defend that very principle, that we and the rest of Europe should be free, liberal, independent democracies. And now, in less than the span of a lifetime, our career politicians in Britain have been happy to give away that democracy to a set of institutions based in Brussels and Luxembourg and Strasbourg, a set of institutions that treat parliamentary democracy, who in fact treat the very concept of democracy itself with total and utter contempt. And that is why I, after 20 years of working in business, decided that I had to get involved in politics, because I want democracy and I want my country back from the European Union. Now, in the early days of this, I have to tell you that Euroscepticism was very much a minority sport. There weren't many of us indulging in it or even admitting to it in public. It was something to be treated with terrible shame. I mean, what an awful, dreadful person I must be to think it's wrong that we're governed by the European Commission. I mean, that's the state that the argument had got to. And indeed, in the early days, campaigning for UKIP, and even my first run at the European Parliament, you know, really, we weren't getting many votes. But since 1999, and since 3 of us got elected to the European Parliament, we have made absolutely massive progress. And I remember my first day, in fact, my first hour of being elected as an MEP, and I did my first interview on live television. I'd never been media trained or anything like that. And the chap said to me, he said, "Congratulations, Nigel. You said you'd do it. None of us believed you. You become an MEP, well done." He said, "But next week," he said, "you'll be off on Eurostar. You'll arrive in Brussels and you'll have a never-ending round of invitations to lunches, dinners, champagne receptions." He said to me, "Do you think you'll become corrupted by the lifestyle?" And I replied live on air, and I still think it's the best answer I've given to any question. I said, "No, I've always lived like that." And far from being corrupted by the lifestyle in Brussels, I have to tell you, 15 years on, I am now utterly repelled by it. Utterly repelled by it. And what did it for me were the events of 2005. We had, under Giscard d'Estaing, a constitutional convention. And if you remember, a constitutional document was drafted which for the first time ever made it absolutely clear publicly that this organisation wasn't about trade, wasn't about cooperation, wasn't about the common market that my mum and dad thought they were voting for all those years ago in 1975. No, they made it clear it was about building a state, a United States of Europe, and unashamedly, that is what the constitutional document was about. But they had a slight problem, and the problem was that Eurosceptic pressure was building in the United Kingdom. And in response to that, President Chirac promised the people of France a referendum on the EU constitution. And the French people voted in that constitution. And guess what they said? They said no. And just a few days later, the Dutch had a referendum. And by a crushing 2/3 to 1/3, they said no as well. And as somebody who had been battling, campaigning, trying to stop the Euro juggernaut in its tracks, I actually, for a period of about 48 hours, thought we had turned the European Union around. I thought this time they've got to listen to the people. This time they've got to recognise that people don't want political union. And what did they do? They rebranded it. They rebranded it as the Lisbon Treaty. They boasted that because it was called a treaty and not a constitution, they would not need to be referendums held again in France or the Netherlands. One country did have a referendum, that was Ireland, who under their constitution have to, and guess what they voted? They voted no, but were bullied and forced to vote again. And up until 2005, I had sat as a British MEP, I'd behaved myself, I'd not caused any particular uproar in the chamber. That was to change, of course. But I was there believing that the United Kingdom was a square peg in a round hole, that we did not fit in with the European Union because of our language, because of our links with the former empire in the shape of the Commonwealth, because we drive on the other side of the road, because we drink beer that is warm and tastes like soap, because we play cricket, and because we have a common law system which is alien to much of the rest of Europe. So up until that moment, when they rebranded the Constitution, the Lisbon Treaty, I believe the United Kingdom should not be part of this union, but if the rest of Europe wanted it, that was fine by me. That was up to them. Well, I can tell you, ever since that day, I now do not just want the United Kingdom out of the European Union, I want Europe out of the European Union. I want to bring this whole thing down. And please, I say that not as somebody that is anti-Europe. I mean, that would be ridiculous, a moronic position to take. I mean, after all, I've got a German wife. She comes from Hamburg. So as I often say, nobody needs to tell me about the dangers of living in a German-dominated household. I shouldn't really tell that one, but I enjoy it. You know, I've worked for French companies and I love Europe. Europe is a fantastic continent. In some ways, it's the greatest continent on the planet because of its diversity, because of its different languages, because of its different peoples and its different cheeses and its different wines and whatever else it may be. And I would say, vive la différence, and let's fight and let's work. And I intend to do this, and I want all the Eurosceptic groups across the European time zone to do this. Let's fight and campaign for a positive alternative vision. Let us have a Europe of sovereign democratic nation states that trade together, that cooperate together, that have mutual respect for each other, that have reciprocal deals with each other, but not a political union which nobody on this continent wants. And ever since 2005, not only have I been campaigning, as I say, for the whole of Europe to be democratic and free, but I also rather changed pace in terms of my speeches in the European Parliament, aided and abetted, I think, by the invention of YouTube, and I'm very grateful to that. And I have to tell you that it's no longer such a lonely place to be a Eurosceptic, because we now have something like 25% of the European Parliament who are Eurosceptic in some shade. Now that's not enough. We would have needed a third to have a blocking minority on legislation, but we are getting closer and there is massive political change going on within the European Union. But not all of it, folks, is positive, because the project that was set up, and let's just remember that the original thinking behind this, rather like communism, the original thinking behind this was a high-minded ideal. It was the idea that with the French and Germans having bashed hell out of each other 3 times in a space of 70 years, and that leading to 2 huge, disastrous global conflicts, that wouldn't it be a good idea to get the French and Germans sitting round the same table and doing business together? That, of course, did make a lot of sense, didn't it? That, of course, was the right and logical thing to do. And I think all of us that understand finance and trade know that the more people trade with each other, the less likely they are ever to fight each other. So the original ideas of this were high-minded ideals, but that actually what has happened is the whole thing has become corrupted. And I talked at the start about democracy. You know, actually, the way they've set this European structure up means that democracy, that people voting in elections, be it national elections, be it European elections, cannot actually change any of the legislation. Because a directive, a European piece of law, is something that only the unelected European Commission have the right to propose, and only the unelected Commission have the ability to repeal or reform. So they've actually set up an anti-democratic system in every sense. And that again is why I'm jealous of you here in Switzerland, because you have your model here of direct democracy. And I tell you something, we're beginning to learn from you, because the Beppe Grillo movement, the five-star movement that has sprung up in Italy. And sometimes I hear people in Brussels say, well, he's only a comedian. And I say, I can't tell who the comedians are anymore in this place. You know, Beppe Grillo's movement, in a sense, has been inspired by the Swiss model. He wants to introduce direct democracy into Italy. And I can tell you that we in UKIP are now looking very hard at your model of direct democracy. And I think it's pretty certain that in our general election manifesto, in the run-up to May next year, that we will follow your lead and that we will advocate that an independent United Kingdom also has your model of direct democracy. So I thank you, Switzerland, for showing us the way. Thank you indeed. Now, as I've said already, I spent 20 years working in business. I worked in the commodities business, the base metals, non-ferrous metals business. But the one day that really decided me that I was going to go into politics was a day in October 1990. And it was about 5:30. We were in the city of London. So that, of course, means we were discussing the day's trading in a pub. And somebody ran in with the news that Britain had just joined the exchange rate mechanism. We had just decided to peg our currency to the Deutschmark as a precursor to us joining what ultimately became the euro. And I won't tell you the initial words that I uttered. They were most certainly in Anglo-Saxon and not complimentary. I thought we'd learnt the lessons of the past. I thought we'd learnt that if you try and fuse together economies that are very different, not just in terms of economics, but in terms of culture, that it comes to a bad end. Well, we tried our experiment, and 2 years into our experiment with the exchange rate mechanism, we had interest rates at double what they should have been. We had a year in 1992 of record business bankruptcies, of record house repossessions, and we put an extra 1 million British people on the unemployment register directly as a result of our career politicians' obsession with tying us in as tightly as possible to this European club. So in some ways, we were lucky. We were lucky in that we had our bad time before the euro was created, and because of that, we didn't join. But when the euro was created, it was obvious to everybody that in purely economic terms, Germany and the northern countries did constitute an optimal currency area. You can ask politically whether countries wanted to be in it, but from the economic viewpoint, it was perfectly clear that actually the euro could work for Germany and the northern countries. What was absolutely perfectly clear was that economies like Greece and Spain and Portugal and indeed even Italy did not fulfill the same economic criteria as Germany and the northern states. And there were many of us in the European Parliament and many economists warning that if you bring the north and south of Europe together inside what is not just a single currency, but a full economic and monetary union, that if you do that, it will lead to disaster. And what happened? They introduced the euro, and overnight, interest rates in Spain and Greece and Ireland and Portugal halved. They had 7 years of completely the wrong interest rates and one of the most insane, false, not just lending, but ultimately property booms that we've ever seen. And boy, have they paid the price for that since. And I just wonder, I genuinely wonder whether a Swiss audience realizes just how grim things have become in the Mediterranean. You know, the Greek economy has now contracted since 2008 by 28%. You know, when the Great Depression hit America and the buddy can you spare a dime period of the mid-30s, the American economy had contracted by 16%. This gives you some idea of what's happening. We're literally witnessing Greece becoming a third world country. We see youth unemployment rates of 60%. We see a neo-Nazi political party in Golden Dawn now getting members elected. And I say neo-Nazi not as a pejorative term, that's what they call themselves. And they've got MPs and MEPs elected. We see Spain with youth unemployment of 55%. There is a zone of misery right across the Mediterranean, massive unemployment, and now they've moved into deflation. Now, I think we've learnt some of the lessons of inflation. We've learnt what causes it, and we've learnt how to deal with it. And sometimes the medicine in dealing with inflation can be quite painful, but it does actually work. But as we've seen after 2 decades of Japanese deflation, deflation is a very difficult economic problem to deal with. You know, people don't buy the fridge freezer. They don't buy the new sofa. They don't buy the new bed because they think it'll be cheaper in 2 months or 3 months' time. It is a terrible downward spiral, not just of prices, but of confidence within an economy. So I fear that you haven't yet seen the worst in the Mediterranean, and actually Italy perhaps is the one that ultimately will blow the European project apart. A country of more than 60 million people with zero growth and rising social tensions. And I feel as if I grew up in a Europe that was divided from east to west by the Berlin Wall. And now I live in a Europe that is divided from north to south by the euro, with the north doing reasonably okay and the south being forced into poverty. And all of it because of this political experiment that is called the European project. And there is nothing that can happen in terms of money transfers between the north and the south. There is nothing that will happen as a result of Draghi buying bonds. There is nothing that will change that imbalance between the north and the south of Europe unless, culturally, the Greeks become like the Germans or the Germans become like the Greeks. And it isn't going to happen. And in fact, what we now see is terrible enmity between the north and the south of Europe. So at no level is this working. And I have to say, actually, the sooner the Eurozone does go bust, the better. It'll be better for the peoples of Europe to get this out of the way, to get back to having their own currencies, to get back to having their own democracies, and to get back to having a chance to re-establish themselves. And I tell you, when Greece pulls out of the euro, gets a devalued currency, I'll be the first person to book a holiday there to try and help them get back on their feet. Because we want Greece to succeed and to do well. But perhaps what worries the Eurocrats even more is there isn't just this north-south divide in Europe, there's another divide that has opened up within the Eurozone. And this goes to the very heart of the economic and political project. And it's simply this, that over the course of the last 4 years, we now see a huge divergence opening up between France and Germany. France is doing very, very badly at the moment. Very badly. Look at their car production figures. Look at their president, God help us. Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. You know, this bloke gets elected into a French economy that's doing badly. The first thing he does is ramp up the minimum wage. And the next thing he does is to propose an income tax rate hike to 75%, a hate tax, just to make sure that if there were any entrepreneurs left in Paris, they caught the next train to London. I mean, it isn't very clever, is it? And the French people are becoming deeply unhappy, and the fact that the Front National won the European elections shows you just how unhappy the French people have become. I personally take the view that if Marine Le Pen was not encumbered by her father and some of the baggage, serious baggage that party has, either she or somebody else, somebody will emerge in French politics over the course of the next handful of years that I think will lead France out of the euro, and with that, actually for us to redefining the entire European project. I hope so. I hope so, because what I see this project doing is actually failing and not working at a whole variety of levels. And I want liberty and democracy to conquer bureaucracy based in Brussels and elsewhere within the EU. I really do want to see that. And I think in some ways, UKIP are the trailblazers amongst the countries within the European Union, because we're the guys that are now making a real impact in British politics. You know, we topped the polls in the European elections earlier this year. We're getting consistently scores in the mid-20% in whole sections of local elections that take place within the English counties. And next Thursday, as a result of a by-election caused by the principled resignation of a sitting Conservative Member of Parliament, and in turn resigning his seat to give the people of Clacton-on-Sea, which I'm sure you've all heard of, haven't you? Well, you will after next Thursday, because next Thursday Douglas Carswell will win that seat, and then UKIP will have its first seat in the Westminster Parliament. We're changing the agenda of British politics. Mr. Cameron this week even sounded like a Euro-skeptic, though I suspect didn't mean it. I'm pretty sure he didn't mean it, really. But I think across the whole of the European Union, I think we're the party that actually the Brussels establishment are the most scared of. Because we're not hedging our bets on this, we're being clear. We want trade, we want cooperation, but we don't want membership of this union. And a United Kingdom that divorces herself from those treaties and renegotiates a sensible trade deal will be followed in very short order by virtually the whole of Northern Europe, who would say, we want this too. So I can't predict to you exactly how this will come to an end, whether it'll be the doomed euro itself, whether it'll be UKIP changing the agenda and winning a referendum in Britain. I don't know how this is going to happen, but I will tell you this. One thing has changed. Up until the beginning of this year, there were millions of people across Europe who said, we are unhappy with this project, we don't like its direction, but we feel powerless because it is inevitable that they will build a United States of Europe. Now, the argument of inevitability has moved to our side of the argument. It is now inevitable that this United States of Europe will not be completed. It is now inevitable that countries will leave the euro. It is now inevitable that countries will leave the Union. We are going to win this great historic battle and struggle. I wish we'd never had to fight it in the first place. And if we'd been more like Switzerland, with your democratic model and with your ability to hold free and fair referendums, I would never have had a career in politics at all. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. I'm sure the people in Switzerland have heard your words, and we all wish you good luck for the future and for winning the next elections in United Kingdom, be a member of, have more members, have a majority even in the English Parliament. That would be great. Mr. Farage is ready to answer some questions of you. Who has some questions?
What is the position of your party after the decision of the Scots not to leave Great Britain?
Did everybody hear that? Did everybody hear that question? Yeah, right. Well, I have to say, I'm pleased that the Scots voted no. I'm amazed that they allowed Alex Salmond to get into such a powerful position. That was yet more ineptitude by Cameron, Clegg and Miliband, who are all, in my view, pretty hopeless. But we've got to know, so the United Kingdom will hold together. Westminster has been very, very bad at devolution. You know, way back in the 1880s, there was a strong demand, which in fact in the end, William Gladstone supported for Irish Home Rule. And Parliament voted it down. We then went into a prolonged civil war with thousands of people dying, and then Ireland broke away in 1921 from the United Kingdom. And we've done the same with Scotland. We've been very grudging at giving away powers to Scotland. And I don't understand it. I personally am more than happy with the United Kingdom having the federal kind of model that you would see in Switzerland or Germany and elsewhere. What's for certain is we can't go on having Scottish members of Parliament coming into the Westminster House of Commons and voting on English-only laws. So the English need their voice within this, and I think in 5 years' time we will have a federal United Kingdom, and one that will hold together, and one where there is more local accountability for raising and spending tax, and I'm completely and utterly happy about it and delighted that the nationalists didn't win. You know, sometimes people call me a nationalist. Well, I respond by saying that I'm a nationist. I think nation states are actually a rather good idea. But I'll tell you something about nationalism. A little bit of nationalism can be a very good thing because people feel they belong to a country and they're proud of that country and they have great hopes for its future. But excessive nationalism is dangerous. And what Alex Salmond stirred up in the last few months of that campaign was a severe, nasty, anti-English, ugly form of nationalism. It was ugly, it was nasty, and I'm pleased that it's been defeated.
I think the task of a good journalist is to give me the necessary information from both sides of the view. What do you say to those journalists from all over Europe or the European Union, putting all people like you in the right side, on the Nazi side, just like the AfD in Germany too? What do you say to those journalists? Are they doing a good job, or should they leave and find something else?
Well, you know, you're right in a sense that the establishment isn't just a political establishment, it includes a media establishment in most countries too. And the establishment supports the status quo, because the status quo is a comfortable position for those people to be in. And they've done everything they can to try to characterize Euroscepticism as being an extreme position. But they're losing the argument, because actually the Euroscepticism we see now in the European Parliament reflects all the political colours of the rainbow. And indeed in the United Kingdom, Euroscepticism was led by the Labour Party. It was the Socialist Party in the 1970s that did not want to join the European Union, that thought we would lose our democratic rights, that thought we'd finish up being dominated by giant failing banks and big multinationals. I'm sounding like a socialist now, aren't I? Because much of their thought process has proved to be right. So, like you, I think we're lucky in Britain. We're lucky that we have a media on both sides of the argument. We have newspapers that are pro the EU, we have newspapers that are now very strongly against the EU. In most of Europe, that is not the case. But look, let's just face up to something, and this is something that the print journalists themselves are finding difficult to face up to. Newspaper sales are collapsing across the Western world. You know, I go on a Sunday morning and I drive to the nearest village and I get out of the car at home and I can barely carry all the newspapers, you know. And my sons who are in their 20s think I'm a dinosaur because they've never bought a newspaper in their life and they're never going to buy a newspaper. And the greatest weapon that we have, the greatest means of propagating the truth, has now been given to us by the internet. We have no excuse now. We can get our message out there. We don't need the conventional media in the way that we did before, and that's the good news.
Mr. Farage, I don't know if you know that, but in February we had a vote in Switzerland to regulate the immigration by ourselves. I heard a lot of you that you want to do that too in the UK. So what's your point? My sister just moved to London to make her doctor at the LSE. I don't know if you know that university. It's a pretty great school in London. And probably she wants to do there, wants to work there in banking maybe. What is your opinion to immigration at all? Do you think qualified immigration, as we do in Switzerland, I believe, is a positive thing, or are you just completely against any immigration in the UK? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good question. Let's get a sort of, you know, 20th century perspective on British immigration. All right, we in the first decade of the 20th century and in the fifth decade of the 20th century, we did provide refuge, not immigration, but we provided refugees. Jews mostly that had come from Russia and later from Germany. Something we'd done before with Huguenots and various other people. Actually, numerically, quite a small number of people, but I'm pleased that we did that, and that's part of our tradition. But planned immigration began after World War II and was predominantly concerned with former British colonies that had stood by us during our toughest times, and from 1950 through to almost the end of the 20th century, immigration into Britain ran at about 30,000 people a year net, all right? About 30,000 people a year. And as a subject, it would occasionally be discussed, but not very much, because the numbers were relatively small, and the people that came were making a commitment to becoming part of our society, and it wasn't an issue. And then what happens? Tony Blair gets in. Decides that he will open the doors up to the whole world, and simultaneously 10 former communist countries from Eastern Europe join the European Union with the total rights of free movement. And now gross immigration into Britain is running at nearly 550,000 people a year. And even if you net the figures off, with Brits that have just had enough and go and live in Spain or whatever it is, even net immigration is running at over 250,000 a year. You know, this is running at 10 times the level that we've been used to. And so we have seen over the course of the last 10 years, compression of wages. Millions of families who take home less now than they did 10 years ago, but the gas bill and the electricity bill has gone up. Why? Oversupply in the labour market. We see areas of Britain where at 5 years old, there are no places in the primary schools. I visited a general practitioner surgery in Kent yesterday afternoon as part of my MEP duties. He has had a 15% increase in the number of people living in the streets around the surgery since 2004. And you know what? I've got a passport, and it says on it, European Union. And that passport is now open to 485 million people. We have no control over the numbers whatsoever. And given what I've just said to you about the plight of Italy and the plight of Spain, I think the immigration numbers can only go up. And I have to say that if I was a youngster, you know, living in Rome, I'd come to London. Of course I would. I'm not blaming the people for doing it, but it is the job of government, just as we believe in controlling, and you've been debating today, we believe in controlling fiscal policy, we believe in controlling monetary policy, well, we should control labour market policy too. And the argument that UKIP will take to the next general election is we're not negative about immigration, we're positive about immigration, but we need to control the quantity and the quality of the people that come to our country. And the best example I think the best example of all is the attitude of Australia. Australia have got it right. They say, look, if you're under the age of 45 and you've got a trade or skill to bring and you haven't got a life-threatening disease and you haven't got a criminal record, which in the case of Australia's history is a bit odd, but anyway, never mind. You know, come to Australia and we'll control it. So, you know, there are 190 countries in the world that control their immigration policy. It's just here within the European Union, and I'm afraid your Swiss politicians caught onto this as well with Schengen and everything else. And what we're doing is literally mad, and we have damaged the prospects of working class people in Britain. We've divided our communities, and the whole thing is rather stupid and rather unnecessary. And I will say this, UKIP has gained respect by speaking out on the European question, but we've gained even more respect by speaking out on the immigration question. Because what our media tried to do, as they try to do in every country, is they try to characterize anyone that discusses this as somehow being far right or extremist. And actually, we've made it a mainstream debate in this country, and 80% now of British people want to take back control of our borders. We've actually won that debate. All we now need to do is make it happen.
May I just add an additional question? Foreign policy. Ukraine, Russia, boycott, Europe at war, British fighter planes in Syria. What is your position?
Thank you. Have you got half an hour or so for me on this one? Well, I tell you what, let me start with the Ukraine, if I can. I've watched on with utter disbelief, mounting frustration, and not been afraid to say, now for over a decade, what the hell are we doing? Saying to the Ukraine that we want you to join our political union. Oh, and while you're at it, why don't you join NATO too? I've been saying for 10 years, that is a deliberately provocative thing to do to a Russia that is more scared of us than we are of them. And whatever you think of the deposed president of the Ukraine, Yanukovych, maybe he was corrupt, but he was at least democratically elected, and he was brought down in a coup by people waving European Union flags, believing he had to go. So I think there is, you know, a tremendous level of guilt on behalf of an expansionist and increasingly imperialistic European Union who have provoked much of what has gone wrong in the Ukraine. Now, that doesn't mean, you know, that I want to be Putin's best mate. It doesn't mean that I think he's an adorable human being. But I'll tell you something, on a very much bigger battle, he's on our side. Because the biggest battle, not just us, but the biggest battle that the Middle East is facing, the biggest battle that much of Africa is now facing, is there is now, you know, a huge and worrying battle that in some way must be fought against the rise of ISIL and radical extremism. That is a battle on which President Putin is actually on our side, as is President Assad, somebody else who has been demonized. We've got virtually everything wrong with our foreign policy over the last few years. virtually everything wrong. And I am by no means a pacifist, and I believe we were right to, for example, fight Argentina over the Falklands. I do. I think there was a very important principle of national self-determination that was clearly at stake there. But I have been opposed to every single one of the last wars that we have fought, and probably most vocally, Libya. You know, Cameron and Sarkozy rush off to bomb Libya, parade around as if they've been great heroes, and what have they done? They've made Libya very much worse than it was before. And I don't care that the House of Commons voted by a vast majority last Friday to start bombing in Iraq. You do not win wars just by bombing. To win wars, you need boots on the ground. And if Islamic extremism is to be fought in the Middle East and across North Africa, it can only be done by soldiers from those countries themselves. Because the more we intervene in those countries, the more they will launch their own jihad against us in our hometowns and our home cities. I am happy to provide expertise. I am happy to provide knowledge. But it is not our place as the United Kingdom and America to intervene in Islamic states in the way that we are. We will make things worse and not better. And at times, I think we're led by idiots.
Mr. Farage, if I can just come back a bit closer to home. I support naturally your views on the Swiss direct democracy, and I applaud your intention to try and introduce it back there in Blighty. However, something else that you could well import from Switzerland would be their voting system, because you well know with the ridiculous system, this first past the post that we have back there in Britain, you have no chance, or very little chance, of transforming your percentage support into actually seats in Parliament. And I just wondered if this was part of your intentions, if it was indeed on your manifesto. Perhaps you might even, dare I say, join up with the Liberal Democrats on this issue and get it put through so that we get a fair representative parliament actually in Britain as well as in Switzerland. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have to say the thought of joining up with Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats did make me wince a bit, but never mind. We have a first-past-the-post system, as the Americans do. The first-past-the-post system used to work in a two-party state. It is hopelessly outdated now, and is providing a big disincentive for people wanting to go out and vote. So the answer in short is yes, I want an independent United Kingdom. That's the first and primary goal, because unless we get that, it doesn't really matter who's in number 10. You know, we're not really voting next year for a change of government in Britain. We're voting for a change of management, because most of the big decisions are actually taken somewhere else. Once that is done, yes, I am with you. I am for electoral reform, and I'm also for recall. I think voters should have the right to sack MPs mid-term if they've done something wrong. And the sooner we introduce that, I think the more the public will feel that actually they've got some control. The big problem in Britain is the disconnect that exists between the Westminster political class and ordinary people. You know, we've got a situation in the UK now where virtually everybody on the front benches, whichever colour rosette they wear, they all go to the same handful of schools, they all go to the same university, they all take the same degree, they all get jobs as researchers after university, none of them have ever had a job in their lives, they marry each other's sisters, they haven't got any hobbies, and we're run by people who have no understanding of what life is like out there in the real world. And I think that's one of the reasons why UKIP is doing as well as it is I think we're actually more in touch with the thoughts, hopes and aspirations of ordinary people than our career class politicians.
Mr. Farage, you talked in your speech about the French Front National, and as a whole French, I'm very interested to know where are the main differences between the UKIP and the Front National, because for me it's clear that the Front National is a very extremist party who is against free markets and against freedom.
There are lots of differences. There are the economic differences. Look, I want liberal free speech and debate in politics, but not gratuitous offence. And a lot of the things that have been said by Marine Le Pen's father and others are, frankly, deeply offensive and do not further political discourse in any way at all. And I'll do one more question, if there's one more, and then it's time for a cup of tea. Well, it may not be tea, but... Where is it?
Mr. Farage, you mentioned the importance in the European Parliament, increase of the Eurosceptics to 25%, and you mentioned also you need maybe 1/3 in order to have a veto power. My question is, there's a saying that those Eurosceptics by feature are not very good in building alliances, but this will be very important that these European skeptics are working together. So my question to you would be, how is the progress between your party with the other Eurosceptics in forming alliances, and which you like and which you don't like? To tell us more about this progress.
Well, there are, you know, Eurosceptics are represented now in nearly all the groups in the European Parliament. You know, the far left group has a strong series of Eurosceptics. I don't think it matters whether we all sit together in the same group or not. If there were more than 33% of us, what would matter is that we all vote the same way on the important issues. As I said earlier, Euroscepticism, just as with Eurofederalism, is represented throughout every opinion from the left through the centre to the right. And also, it is difficult, you know, it is difficult to form strong political alliances with parties that come from other countries, because the whole reason that the euro doesn't work, the reason that the European Union doesn't work, is that in this continent of ours, we are all different. And there's nothing wrong with us being different. I want us to be different. And as long as we're democratic and different, and we trade together, we'll have a better future than we've got today.
Ladies and gentlemen, we all want to thank you so much for being in Switzerland. It's really great to see your points of view. And we both like tobacco, we both like alcoholics, and we both, of course, like freedom. And that's the reason why we have here for you EU-free Swiss-brewed whiskey. Here's... It's a nice label, Majors and casks stored in a glacier cave. And then we have Swiss cigars made in Switzerland with no EU regulation.